Welcome back. We call this meeting order. Welcome to meeting number 93, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. Pursuant to Standing Order 1064, the committee is meeting to resume consideration of requests for contracts between the federal government and electric vehicle battery manufacturing companies. Reminder not to put our earpieces next to the microphone. This causes feedback and potential injury to our valued translators. Now, when the meeting was adjourned on Friday, we were debating an amendment moved by Mr. Souza. We are resuming debate on the amendment from Mr. Souza, and I see already Mr. Massey has his hands up.
I'm just waiting, though, for translation, Mr. Chair, so maybe put me off the list for now. So, sorry, there's some rough stuff. I have something coming, but the translation's not ready, so maybe go to the next speaker.
Sure.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Taking a list. Mr. Kuzmierczak, before I go to you, we will recognize and say hello and welcome back to Ms. Shanahan, one of our OGGO alumni. Welcome back, and we'll move away from you now. Back to Mr. Kuzmierczak.
Yeah, thank you.
Taking a speaking list on the amendment.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and delighted to be here with our committee mates. Welcome some of the new members to this illustrious committee, the mighty OGGO, and I'm sure we're going to have an interesting and enlightening and illuminating discussion here. So, as I understand it, we're back to discussing. Or 2 out of the 3 would be good, and friendly, I would say. That's really important. Nonetheless, this is an important, obviously, issue. The stakes here are significant, and I think that's why we're having such a discussion that is at times can be a little heated, but also, this is serious business that we're talking about here, and there is a lot on the line, and I think that's why. Again, these discussions are sometimes difficult. The debates are sometimes difficult, and at the same time, I think that's the reason why we've been meeting on these issues now for many hours. Last week and this week as well too. We have, I believe, 6 hours of meeting scheduled this evening, because again, we know that this is a serious issue that all sides are taking great interest in. I want to pick up on some of the commentary from last week, and the importance, really, I think, is what is at the heart of this discussion or this debate that we're having here today is the balance, and I think that is really what this issue and the debate is about. Is what is the balance, and what are we trying to balance here? And I think that we are trying to balance, on the one hand, trying to share as much information as we can to live up to that standard of being an open government and share information with Canadians. At the same time, we know that we want to ultimately protect the interests of Canada. And I know my colleague from Windsor West had a chance, just like I did, to serve as a city councillor on Windsor City Council. He served there for many years first, and left a legacy there. Was in very many ways a pioneer, and blazed the trail for those that came after him, including myself, for which I am grateful. And I know that as a city councillor, we all had to balance or find a balance between those 2 polarities, transparency, and at the same time protecting the interests of the country. In that case, the interests of the municipality. And I think about the fact that when you look at the city of Windsor, and you look at most municipalities in Ontario, I believe that there was a study that was done. I mean, every year they publish the statistics. But most municipalities in Ontario, they meet in camera probably 20% of the time is what the statistics normally say. So 20% of the time, municipalities meet in camera. Those are confidential meetings. Those are meetings that are carried out behind closed doors, and decisions are made by the mayor and by city council. I can tell you that as a city councilor, we had numerous important meetings that dealt with sensitive issue. Again, I'd say about 20% of our time was spent in camera. Some of those issues were sensitive. For example, when we had a partnership or a deal, an economic development partnership or a deal or agreement, some of that information was not made public. Some of that information was kept within in camera. But I know that the city council went in camera as well too for even minor issues. You know, I've sitting in camera when a parking lot was being transferred, ownership was being transferred, a parking lot worth less than $100,000, and we met in camera to discuss the dispossession of that parking lot. And it sort of underscores and highlights, you know, that again, like I said, on an entire spectrum of issues, we discussed in camera at City Council. Surely, a lot of those issues are minor, quite minor, compared to what we're talking about here. What's at stake here, which is a $6 billion investment in my community in Windsor, 2,500 good-paying jobs, local, Canadian unionized workers. There's a lot at stake here, and I think that's why it underscores why we are being so careful and cautious with this discussion as we try to find that balance, and we try to strive to strike that balance. And when you look at city councils even that are dealing with a whole panoply of issues of various importance and significance and sensitivities, there's actually a municipal act that governs that governs what is a justifiable basis for a closed meeting. And I want to read a little bit here from a company's website that deals with open government and deals with the Municipal Act and deals with closed meetings at the municipal level. And the article here from Nelligan Law states, while municipalities are legally required to ensure their meetings are open to the public, there is provision in the Municipal Act of 2001 for certain forums to be private. However, municipalities must assess very carefully whether the limited exceptions to go in camera apply. And so that's really, really important here when you're looking at that. And just to read, what are some of those? What are sort of those types of issues?
This is obviously irrelevant.
We could get to the amendment eventually, Mr. Kuzmierczak.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what our goal is. But what I'm trying to what I'm trying to establish here is that even at the municipal level, there is an understanding that you have to balance transparency and accountability, again, with protecting the interests, in this case, whether it's the corporation, the City of Windsor, or whether it's Canada, country Canada. And I think it's really important for us to understand that, because it's a part of the discussion, I think, that has been left out of this discussion. And so if you look at the Ontario.ca website, the Government of Ontario website, it has a subheading that's titled Balancing Transparency and Confidentiality. This is provincial. And it says here, as discussed previously in this chapter, it is a good practice to conduct business in transparent and accountable manner, and that municipal meetings be open to the public, subject to certain exceptions. In other words, municipalities are encouraged to consider openness and transparency to be appropriate in most circumstances, including when making decisions about whether or not to close a meeting. And then it goes on to say, and this is important, there will be times, however, in the course of business where information should or even must be kept confidential So here you have the province of Ontario, here you have the provincial government talking about the need to balance those two competing interests at times. And then it goes on to say closing a meeting, under the headline closing a meeting. A meeting or part of a meeting may be closed to the public if the subject matter being considered is, and it actually spells out what are the issues that are grounds for closed meetings or confidentiality. First one is the security of the property of the municipality or local board. Second one is a personal matters about an identifiable individual, including municipal or local board employees. And I would say that one of the concerns of looking at this contract of these companies is that we want to make sure that we're protecting certain sensitive information that are personal matters about an identifiable individual. And I think we have to be very careful to safeguard that important information. It goes on to say a proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land by the municipality or local board. A couple things are pertinent here. It's what I mentioned before. Even at something small as a parking lot worth $50,000, the city would go in camera to discuss, even on an issue as seemingly trivial as the disposition of a $50,000 parking lot. And yet, again, there's grounds and justification in the Municipal Act of Ontario for exactly that. And when you're talking about this agreement with the contract, you have to also be aware that the City of Windsor is very much a partner to this agreement with Stellantis and LG. The City of Windsor and my council colleagues there, past and present, they made a very bold move when the City of Windsor decided to put significant resources into the deal, into the agreement. And so the City of Windsor is absolutely a player in this. They are the ones that actually assembled the land. It needs to be emphasized that it was the City of Windsor that assembled the land for that battery plant. They absolutely are a partner to this agreement. And so we have to be careful also to make sure that in that contract there is not information that would in any way not only be injurious, obviously, to Nexstar or to workers, but also would in any way disclose information that is sensitive information that the City of Windsor might consider important as well too. And so those are the things that we have to look at. The Government of Ontario goes on to say other grounds for confidential meetings, labor relations or employee negotiations. And again, that is something that is important. That is important as well too. Another point, litigation or potential litigation, including matters before administrative tribunals affecting the municipality or local board. Next is advice that is subject to solicitor-client
Point of order,
privilege,
Chair. This
including
is
communication necessary
We have
for that
one of our
purpose.
Mr. Kuzmierczak. Mr. Janos, go ahead.
the member is reading out policies for municipality around what information can be discussed in camera, and has done that for some time. What we're debating at this committee is making public contracts that this government has signed, contracts worth over $40 billion. The public deserves to see that information, but his long trek down memory lane is obviously
Thanks,
in no
Mr.
way relevant to what we're supposed to
Thanks,
be talking
Mr.
about.
Janos. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Turnbull.
I would just say that the member seems to be making a cogent argument about the balance of confidentiality and transparency. It seems to me to be highly relevant to the debate at hand.
Thanks, Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Kuzmierczak, did you want to speak for yourself? Or continue with Mr.
No,
Turnbull.
I support my line of
I understand
argument.
I understand what you're getting to. I would ask that you please come back to the amendment, at least notionally. Thanks.
No, for sure. And again, just to continue on, because I think it is important to highlight we're highlighting here, again, that as my colleague had mentioned, that there is a balance we're trying to strike here. And I'm trying to utilize the provincial government and also the municipal government, the other two levels of government, to highlight the fact that even in their worlds, in their operations, in their work, clearly there are circumstances where information is not made public to protect the interests of the organization, protect the interests of residents, protect the interests of whether it's the province, the municipality, or in this case, in our case, it's the protect the interests of Canadians as well too. And not only is there a philosophical or cultural understanding that there is that balance that really has been around for hundreds of years. I mean, this is not something that is new. The Municipal Act has developed over time, but there is a framework. I think that's what I'm trying to point to, is that this isn't something that is simply a part of our culture or values. It certainly is part of our culture and part of our values as Canadians to make that balance, to be pragmatic. But what I'm trying to underscore here is that there is also a structure. There is actually a policy structure around the balancing of confidentiality and transparency, which is, again, at the heart of why we're here. It's why we're debating this. We're trying to get this balance absolutely correct. But again, it's important to highlight for Canadians that there is an absolute precedent from the provincial and the municipal level. And here's another example that I wanted to highlight. Again, you go down the list of the province of Ontario. What information can be kept confidential? It says here, information explicitly supplied in confidence to the municipality or local board by Canada, a province or territory, or a crown agency of any of them. So even when information is being shared by a third party, whether it's another government, whether it's another organization, in confidence, there are mechanisms in place. There is an expectation in place. There are mechanisms in place and expectations in place that that information remains confidential. And then it goes on, and this is the really important one. This is the one that I really wanted to highlight because I think it really gets to the heart of this issue. And so again, this is on the Province of Ontario website, and it says that meetings can go in camera, can be confidential under the following circumstances. And I quote, "A trade secret or scientific, technical, commercial, financial, or labor relations information supplied in confidence to the municipality or local board, which, if disclosed, could reasonably be expected to prejudice significantly the competitive position or interfere significantly with the contractual or other negotiations of a person, group of persons, or organization." I mean, that encapsulates perfectly what is at stake here and why on this side of the table we feel it is important to speak up and stand up for the interests of Canada. Again, because there is so much at stake here. So I want to read it again because I think it's important. "A trade secret or scientific, technical, commercial, financial, or labor relations information supplied in confidence to the municipality or local board, which, if disclosed, could reasonably be expected to prejudice significantly the competitive position or interfere significantly with the contractual or other negotiations of a person, group, or of persons or organization." And one last point here, because I think this one's even more important. It's shorter. It's only 2 sentences, but I think it's really important. So this is important. "A trade secret or scientific, technical, commercial, or financial information that belongs to the municipality or local board and has monetary value or potential monetary value." So this is important here. this is really important here because, again, it's even in the provincial government. Again, you see that not only is the value of confidentiality, not only do you have the culture of confidentiality there that appears in the way that the government governs itself, but there's also a structure and legislation around it and a policy around it as well too, which means that it's very purposeful. It's not happenstance and purposeful. Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, I should say, I know that I've regaled you with this information, and I hope that one day you're on Jeopardy and this helps you answer that question, Final Jeopardy question. But with that, I will yield the rest of my time to my colleague, Brenda Shanahan.
Afraid you don't have that right. Miss Atwin is next on, actually it's Mr. Baines, then Miss Atwin's on the speaking order.
I'll strike
So,
my time.
okay. Miss Atwin, we were promised something interesting, so I hope you can deliver that where Mr. Kuzmirchuk did. But I have Miss Atwin, then Mr. Massey, then Miss Shanahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield my time as well. Thank you.
I'm sensing where we're going here. Mr. Massey, will you also yield your time? So, Miss Shanahan,
Yes, thank you,
Wow.
Mr. Chair. You were
it's like I have a crystal
you were ahead of
ball
the
or
game.
something.
As usual, you're ahead of the game.
Miss Shanahan, welcome back to OGGO. It's up to you to.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I see that everyone is waiting with bated breath for what I now have to say. So it's a pleasure for me to ask the committee at this time, or to say to the committee that I would like to withdraw the amendment that is currently under discussion. And I think the Chair may need to ask for unanimous consent to do so.
Couple things. Ms. Shanahan is subbing in for Mr. Souza, whose was amendment, asking for UC to withdraw the amendment. Do we have consent to withdraw the amendment? I will ask one last time. If you wish not to, just say no. Okay, we have a no for withdrawing the amendment. Next on the well, we can continue on that, or we can just have a quick vote. I think I know where we're going on this, so are we prepared to vote on the original amendment?
I'm going to try a bit about this amendment.
Okay. No, actually, no, we started the vote, Mr. Perkins.
You had started the vote?
I just said we're going to the vote.
You just said it, but anyway.
Colleagues, if someone wishes a point of order or something else, please speak up, not after the fact, putting me in a difficult position. And don't finish my sentences either.
Monsieur le Président, je sais que le vote a été appelé.
I know that we've called for the vote, Mr. Chair, but are we voting to withdraw the amendment, or are we voting on the amendment? On the amendment? The question is on the amendment of Mr. Souza.
You had said we'll go to a vote unless there's anyone else that wants to speak.
It seemed pretty clear if we were going to a vote, Mr. Perkins, but I understand.
So on Mr. Souza's amendment, Ms. Atwin. Yes. Mr. Baines.
Yes.
No, let me be clear. This is not to withdraw the amendment. This is on the amendment. So, just to be clear, the vote on the on Mr. Souza's amendment on of the main motion. So we have Ms. Atwin, we have Mr. Baines, Mr. Juari,
Yes.
Mr. Kuzmirchik,
Yes.
Ms. Shanahan,
Yes.
Mr. Perkins,
No.
Mr. Jennis,
No.
Mr. Kirk,
No.
Madame Vignola?
No.
Mr. Massey?
No.
So it's 5 nays, 5 yeas.
Sorry, no.
Then 6 nays, 5 yeas.
We are now back to the original motion. Taking a speaking list. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter?
On the original motion.
Well, no speaking list. Can we vote on the original motion? So, voting on the original amendment, or the original motion, if I could speak properly. The motion.
So on the motion of Ms. Block as amended, Ms. Atwin?
Against.
Mr. Baines?
No.
Mr. Juari?
Against.
Mr. Kuzmirchik?
No.
Mr. Souza? Sorry, I apologize. Ms. Shanahan, my apologies.
All right. Something I have to declare to everyone.
My apologies.
No.
That'll teach you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Souza. Ms. I promise I will get there. Mr. Perkins.
Yes.
Mr. Jennis.
Yes.
Mr. Couric.
Yes.
Madame Vignola. Mr. Massey.
No.
6 nays, 4 yeas.
Yeah, Mr. Massey, the motion goes down. Our motion is defeated. Mr. Massey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a new motion I'd like to table today and now, and it's being circulated, I know electronically. I hope that it's getting through. And I can either read the motion in and then start from there, but I leave it myself in your hands.
And why don't you read it in
Okay.
slowly?
Yes. And some of this is familiar, but there's some parts that were appropriately pointed out by yourself, Mr. Chair, that made it very awkward to do a sub-amendment to the motion, so we've accommodated the changes. So that in order to issue the production of copies of any contract, memorandum of understanding, or any other contract between the ministers and the departments directly related to the implementation of the contracts agreements, including but not limited to all provisions relating to the hiring or use of foreign workers and concerning language requirements and language of work, and, in quotes, quotes A, Stellantis, NV, LG Energy Solutions Limited, Nexstar Energy Inc., or Volt Energy Solutions, there's a whole list of them here, Inc., related to the construction of an electric vehicle battery facility in Windsor, Ontario.
Sorry, point of order, Chair.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Mr. Jennis.
So, Mr. Chair, the NDP had long said they supported transparency for this contract. They just flip-flopped and voted. Let me finish.
I'll decide.
Let me
Thanks
finish
for the
now.
advice from the
You've talked a lot here, Mr. Kuzmirchik.
That's not a point of order.
The NDP have just completely contorted and flipped themselves over to vote with the government to bury these contracts. Now they're proposing apparently a new motion, which is to try to save face in the midst
Mr.
of
Chair,
this
that
cover-up.
point of order,
We don't have
this is a point of order.
copies
That's
of
not
that
appropriate, Mr.
motion.
Chair.
The member is saying he's reading it out, but he's very clearly not starting from the beginning.
Mr. Chair, he will.
This
my
is a.
colleague will
Sorry,
have-
let me
Mr. Chair,
interrupt
point of
just
order.
one moment, Mr. Generous. Mr. Kuzmirchuk,
Yes. This is
please.
clear. This
Yeah.
is black and white.
Let him
Yeah.
finish, and then you can
Yeah.
speak in, or I'm going to address, I'm going to follow up another issue
After the
on
amendment,
this.
he will have the time to argue
Yeah.
whether he is for or against it.
Right.
This is not the time, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
This is a
Thanks for
point of
that.
order.
Just get to the point, Mr. Genovese,
Yeah.
and then I'm going to.
Mr. Chair,
address it.
I'm very familiar with the rules. I would like to know what this motion is. We have
He's
not
just-
received a
point of
copy of
order,
it.
Mr. Chair, he's reading the
Can
motion.
you
Mr.
respect the
Kuzmierczak.
chair, Mr. Kuzmierczak? I've been recognized and you haven't.
Let him finish his point of order, and then I will
Yeah.
chime in on issues.
And you can read
continue,
out
but
municipal
please,
policies that have nothing to do with this
Mr.
some
Genovese,
other
can
time.
you return
Chair, but-
and to the point?
Yes, Chair. Mr. Massey was very clearly not reading from the beginning of the motion. We need the full text of the motion, ideally in writing. He's provided no notice of it, and he's not obliged to do that, but we need to be able to have the text of the motion fully. The NDP just defeated our call for transparency for the disclosure of the contract. They could have proposed an
Mr.
amendment.
Not a point of
That is
order.
hidden.
This is beyond the pale.
So we need to see the
He is
text
mostly
of the motion.
correct on that. I am just going to chime in that I could very well I'll let Mr. Massey continue, but we're going to go no further. We're going to suspend afterwards because I do believe procedurally it might be out of order. But I'll let you just read it in, and then we are going to suspend immediately after. We'll not continue with other point of orders or anything else. Go ahead, Mr. Massey.
Fair enough, Mr. Chair. I was on section B, that Volkswagen Group, Volkswagen AG, Volkswagen Group of America, Inc., or Power CO SE related to the construction of an electric vehicle battery facility in St. Thomas, Ontario. C, Northvolt AB, Northvolt of North America, Northvolt Batteries North America, Inc., or Cubery, Inc., related to the construction of an electric vehicle battery facility in Saint-Bill-le-Grand, Quebec. D, Ford Motor Company of Canada, Limited, Eco Pro BM Company, Limited, Eco Pro Innovation Company, Limited, Eco Pro Global, Eco Pro Co. Limited, Eco Pro Eco Cam Canada, Inc., Eco Pro, a lot of eco stuff going on here, Eco Pro Cam Canada General Partner, Inc., Saskatchewan, Ontario, SKEI Technology, LT, SK Inc., SK Innovation Company, LT, SK Engineering and Construction Company, LT, Sun Lake Company, LT, or Eco Pro Cam Canada, LG, related to the construction of electric vehicle battery materials productions plant in Quebec, and Umicore Rechargeable Battery Materials Canada, Inc., Umicore SA/NV, or Umicore Canada, Inc., related to the construction of an electric vehicle battery materials production plant in Loyalist Township, Ontario, and order due issue for copies of all labor market impact assessments, including the applications for them, prepared in relation to the construction of an electric vehicle battery facility in Windsor, Ontario, provided when these documents are received by the clerk. New, this is another section of F, so it's just F right now, but it was to kind of replace the old F, that departments and agencies tasked with gathering these
Point of order,
documents-
Chair. There is no old F. This is not an amendment. This member voted against the previous motion. There is no old F. So he seems to be reading parts of a new motion
I realize-
without reading the whole
and
motion.
I realize that, and that, as I mentioned, it may very well be, I've been discussing this with our clerk, it may very well be completely out of order, but I'm just going to let him finish reading it, and then the clerk and
Yeah.
we will suspend, then we'll come back with a ruling. But you may very well be right, Mr. Genovese, but we're just going to let him finish speaking.
Yeah, well, yeah,
And then
and
we will
I won't
immediately suspend.
reference those elements. I was just doing that out of courtesy for members so they could follow along. That the departments and agencies tasked with gathering these documents redacted according to the Access to Information Acts, with the exception that all companies must fully disclose and make publicly available to correct any misinformation of the following. 1, the number of foreign workers who will be building the plants involved in equipment installation, technology transfer, training, and operations. 2, the number of Canadian temporary/construction jobs to be created and how many permanent production positions are to be created as part of the contract guarantees. 3, the steps that will be taken to prioritize the employment of Canadians for building the plants and equipment installations. 4, that redacted versions of these documents shall be deposited with the clerk of committee within 3 weeks in both official languages. 5, that information related to the above specific areas not included in the contracts be provided by the above-mentioned companies to the committee in writing. Now, another section, G, would be the committee invite CEOs of Stellantis, NV, LG Energy Solutions Limited, Nexstar Energy, Inc., to answer questions. H, the committee calls on the governments to continue to work with all the companies mentioned in the motion to develop training and job opportunities for Canadian workers for construction to equipment, installation/operation, technology transfer and production, and as well, finally, that the committee submit an access to information request to ask the Information Commissioner to complete a third-party review of the redactions to ensure a complete process and report back to the committee for an in-camera meeting.
Mention we are going to suspend. to get at this before the vote.
Alors, merci de votre patience.
We will rule the new one in order. So, Mr. Massey, it is in order. You've got the floor. I see Mr. Genuis and Mr. Perkins. Go ahead, Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the indulgence of the committee and for the opportunity to speak to the motion here. It's a very important issue, and what I've realized over the last number of days and actually weeks is how this issue is not helping anyone, whether you're in the auto industry, whether you're actually investing in the projects, or whether you're here on Parliament Hill. And we have become entrenched on a spot that I think is not going to be helpful for any particular party or organization, and more importantly, Canadians. And so I've been trying to work at finding a compromise. And there are things that you do in politics where you can compromise without compromising your principles. And that's what my motion to me is about. Coming from an auto town where I've seen how every job matters, and witnessing also as your jobs are taken and lost to other people in other countries because they have gone forward with competitive practices or blatantly buying some of those jobs, whether it be Alabama, whether it be other parts of the United States, whether it be Mexico. I've seen the travesty of the families that have taken place where generations of families have lost their income, lost their opportunity to have a chance to better their lives and also, more importantly, contribute to their communities and have gainful employment. And that is something that we are recovering with these agreements. And there is a lot of debates about the value of the agreements, and there's a lot of debate about the industry in itself. But the reality here is that if you are either in the game or you're not, there's one or two things. In Canada, for those that aren't aware, we used to have actually a national auto policy, an auto pact. The auto pact was actually drafted and created, and it led to us being number 2 in the world in automotive assembly. The auto pact, when we signed the NAFTA agreement, was challenged by Japan, and Japan then took us to the WTO, and we lost that. The auto pact was about actually getting us guaranteed market access into the United States. And so we lost that competitive element. We went from number 2 in the world to 10, and we've recovered a little bit from that to automotive assembly. In fact, we used to have national corporate head offices in Canada. We don't have those really anymore at all. And so the motion here is to deal with the investment strategies that are going on. And I have long called for an auto policy that was more predictable and is really born from CAW, now Unifor, Jim Stanford and others, that actually had a component element that sought to try to find employment hours and investment as the primary indicators of why the investment would be worthwhile, and to also deal with the United States. There's often those people that talk about the United States being the capitalist-centric part of the world, but I've witnessed over the years them throwing money from the state level, from the federal level, from the municipal level, to basically decimate our industry over years. So with these projects, there's been a number of different issues that have come out and a lot of different numbers that have been flown around, and that's not helpful. And what I'm asking for in this motion here is to go through a process that would be the normal process for if there was going to be an access to information, a redaction of documents, and so forth, but with a caveat to have some extra accountability by Parliament and also some new information that would also be provided that is not in those documents. Some of those numbers that have been floated around from the companies and from others will not be in the documents that we would procure, whether they be redacted or not redacted. So this motion is going to actually address that, because what really people care about right now and what municipalities and others have to focus on is how many foreign workers are going to come to Canada. And there's two different forms of sets that are taking place. There are those that are building the facilities that we have and creating those facilities, and those are the building trades jobs that are very important. And then second to that, there's also the operations and the development of those jobs, which is a process where you will actually have foreign workers, and sometimes they're Americans, sometimes they're Mexicans. In this case, in my community, it's going to be South Koreans that will be coming over to actually help us set up operations. And that's because we don't have some of the capacity. Do I think we could have done a better job of training and uploading up those things? Yes. Have we done it? No. Canada does not have a national strategy anymore when it comes to actually employment. We used to have Human Resources Development Canada in the old days. Then it became Service Canada, and now it's up to each province to determine how their training takes place. So that's a bigger debate for a different time. But the reality is, I do not want people coming to my community feeling that they're not welcome. That is not helpful for the community. It's not helpful for those individuals and those families. If we're going to get long-term employment out of that, then we need to make sure that there's a trusting process that people know what they're in for. And that includes taxpayers from all across Canada, and includes the local people as well, too, because we want this to be as successful as possible at this point in time. The reality is these deals, some of them are happening, and they're being constructed right now. So do we actually make it worse, or do we make it better at this point? So I believe the transparency about the numbers and expectations of the numbers of the workers that are going to be there should be out there and will build public confidence to actually do things better. And I mentioned even, the fact that we could have been dealing with this earlier could have been how we can actually turn perhaps some of these advantages to our favor if we do, investments, say, for example, to housing and making sure later on they're not-for-profit housing. There's other creative things that can take place if we move forward. Other parts of this is to talk about with regards to getting specifics from the companies that was not provided or mentioned in writing, so that will come to the committee. That's another part of the plan that will be tabled here. And that will also provide, again, more documentation than either redacted or unredacted documents. We will then have an opportunity to have actually the CEOs come to this committee and explain and talk about the investments that they're making and also what it means to our communities. That is going to be a positive environment to be part of, and there will be also the opportunity for members of all political parties to ask tough questions that they believe are necessary for Canadians. And I think that's also an opportunity for the companies to talk about specifically how their investments they view as a partnership with regards to this issue. We'll also talk about, another issue which I'm a little bit disappointed in, and calling on the committee to continue with the companies and also the government to put some better benchmarks out there for creating jobs, training, and opportunities. What happens perhaps out of this if we get in front of this now and we actually get this committee with a motion or at least a process where we're not continuing to stall through here for different reasons, and I'm not going to cast negative elements on it. But if the workers in Windsor through the first plant here and other workers in other parts of the country get that training and get that experience, perhaps, and maybe other people from other communities that are going to eventually get those battery plants and those facilities, what if they can come to Windsor and also learn some of the skills and opportunities? Then perhaps we can get more in front of this and actually reduce the need for foreign trade workers, because also they're going to be there's a short supply for everybody. So if we can do more of that training, then perhaps we can actually reduce or reverse some of those potential things. Lastly, I do want to mention, and I know that it's not a perfect solution, but it is what I would ask for, the information commissioner. We can either do it through an ATIP. I don't know if the question is, or somebody's have raised to me, whether we can do that through the committee here or whether we have to do it as individuals. I'm open to learning about that element. But the point being is we would come back to an in-camera meeting, so we'd have a third party that would look at what the company redactions would be, and then we would see what the government process for redactions that went through the normal process, and would be able to go in camera and find out whether or not there are problems with that, and whether or not there was accountability, and whether or not there was going to be some challenges to it. So for those reasons, I've put together the motion here, and I'm hoping that this has at least enough elements to it to give some more public confidence of where we need to go. I'll conclude with this, Mr. Chair. I very appreciate the fact that I'm a guest of this committee. And I appreciate the fact that we've had to put a lot of time already in it. What I'm worried about is, I think the worst of all solutions is that we sit here to Christmas and beyond, the holiday season and beyond, with filibustering. Meanwhile, we're not showing any type of movement towards trying to find a solution, and the investment opportunities in our country are not only going to be seized to some degree, they're also going to be under scrutiny further, and there'll be no clarity at all about what the terms and conditions are for the jobs, leading to more confusion and more public debate. The jobs here are significant. The country's auto investment is significant because it also leads to transferable technology and other types of innovation. So with that, I will say thank you for the indulgence of some of the confusion around what's taken place to try to find a solution, but I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Massey. Mr. Genuis.
Chair, there's not a lot that surprises me in this place, but I am quite shocked, frankly, by the approach that the NDP has taken. So here's where we are, right? Over $40 billion that the federal government is planning on spending on these various subsidies. Information has come out that these subsidies are, in many cases, going to fund foreign replacement workers, not creating paychecks for Canadians, but supporting foreign replacement workers. And as a result of a lack of transparency around these contracts and concerns about how this spending of Canadian tax dollars is going to bring in foreign replacement workers instead of creating good jobs here in Canada, Conservatives have sought transparency from the government. We've tried to get copies of the contract, which we believe that the shareholders, the taxpayers, the people who are paying these subsidies, and the workers who are affected by them deserve to see. So we signed the required letter, brought this committee together, and at the time we had the support of the other opposition parties saying that these contracts should be made public. And that is a principled position that I think is widely supported by Canadians, especially supported by workers. We stand with workers. We believe that creating good jobs for Canadian workers is critical, and that the government has an obligation to be transparent in these cases about public subsidy and about what the impact of that subsidy is going to be in terms of workers and jobs. And we just had at this committee the NDP, after Liberal filibustering to block that motion, we had the NDP fold. We had, after grand statements by Mr. Massey on transparency and on supporting workers, the NDP have folded like a cheap suit and voted against our motion. We just had a vote on our motion to require the disclosure of these contracts. Now, the Liberals had been filibustering. They ended their filibuster. Our motion came to a vote, and the NDP, despite saying they supported the motion, despite the fact that we had incorporated a number of their amendments that refined the language, the NDP voted against it. So much for transparency, so much for workers. A little bit of pressure from the Trudeau Liberals in the form of a filibuster leads the NDP to changing their position and abandoning all of their stated principles. And what do we have before us? We have this motion from Mr. Massey that says a parliamentary committee should file an ATIP. Mr. Speaker, news for anybody watching. Any member of the public has a right to file an ATIP. Parliamentary committees have a constitutionally protected, unfettered right to send for documents and to set their own timelines in the process. We don't have to go through the long drawn out and, frankly, as a result of this government's action, increasingly troubled and broken ATIP process. We can send for and order the production of documents, and this committee has an unfettered right to request those documents. And after a little bit of pressure from the Liberals, the NDP position is, well, okay, we're not going to order the production of these documents. We're not going to make them public. We're going to have a parliamentary committee file an ATIP request. What a debasement of the rights and the role of parliamentary committees. What a disgrace.
Mr. Turnbull?
I was on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee when we studied the effects of yelling into microphones for the interpreters, and I just feel for them. They get acoustic shock. There's been a lot of reports of that, and the member is clearly animated at the moment. I understand he's totally capable of making his arguments, and that's all fine and dandy, but I would just ask maybe that you could...
We would be advised,
perhaps you could remind the member...
Mr. Turnbull,
yeah?
I have the floor. We would be advised by our translators if there was a volume issue. I appreciate your concern, but we would be advised.
Just out of compassion.
And we are fine. Go ahead, Mr. Janus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to have utmost respect for the interpreters, but I will take my lead from you in terms of that, as opposed to from a member across the way. So if there's anything I should do to moderate my approach, I will adjust accordingly. But in the meantime, we have a Conservative motion ordering the production of these documents to provide workers with the transparency that they need. That motion defeated on an NDP flip-flop. And then they put up this fig leaf to defend their flip-flop by saying, well, maybe the committee should file an ATIP request. Consistently, we've seen that the NDP, despite saying they stand for workers, will give in to any kind of pressure from the Trudeau Liberals. I don't know if we should be as a result of this, sending for the unredacted versions of the NDP Liberal coalition deal to find out what exactly is the nature of the leverage that they have. But I am surprised. I am disgusted. I am disgusted that the NDP would fold up so quickly. It was not as if we were in the midst of some intractable filibuster situation. The debate on the main motion that Conservatives had proposed had collapsed. We were into a vote, and all that had to happen was that the opposition members had to stand behind their stated positions. All of the opposition parties had spoken, had said they supported the amendment, had supported the main motion that was on the floor from the Conservatives, which had already included amendments from the Bloc and the NDP. And if they had all simply stuck to their positions, we would have ordered the production of these contracts. But the NDP have abandoned their stated principles, abandoned transparency, abandoned workers. But we're going to give them one more chance. We're going to give them one more chance by moving an amendment to this motion that actually sets it back on the right track. And I hope that the NDP will hear from Canadians, will hear from the workers that they pretend to represent, and will reconsider the importance of honoring the principle of transparency. So I want to add in the first line the words, and upon receipt, immediate posting on its website of, so that the first sentence would now read that in order to issue for the production of, and upon receipt, immediate posting on its website of copies of any contract, and so on and so forth. In the section titled New F, I will strike the words, and agencies tasked with gathering these documents be redacted according to the Access to Information Act, with exception that all companies must, also striking the words to correct any misinformation. So it would simply read that the department fully disclose.
Mr. Genuis.
Okay.
Mr. Massey.
I remember the member chastising me for using new F, and I just want to remind him he probably shouldn't be referring to new F again.
It literally is written in the text of the motion that was distributed, so it doesn't make any sense to me, but the member moved a motion which has the word new F.
Why don't you move, or go ahead, Mr. Genuis?
Okay. So maybe that can be corrected in a subsequent amendment. But the revised section, which says new F on the page, but likely just was supposed to say F, should now read that the departments fully disclose and make publicly available the following. Also striking in 4, that redacted versions of, and then striking I regarding submitting the access to information request. I believe that these changes give effect to the principled Conservative position that we believe that when taxpayers' money are involved in these contracts, tens of billions of dollars, we're talking thousands of dollars per family. Thousands of dollars per Canadian family are going into these subsidies, the Canadians that are paying this money deserve access to this information, deserve to know what the impact is on them, what the impact on workers is. So this amendment gives the NDP a chance to flip-flop back to the right position.
Mr. Genuis, can I interrupt very quickly? Are you fine? I understand you've provided both languages. The amendment, are you fine if we distribute it right now?
Yes.
Perfect. Go ahead. Continue, sir.
So the NDP said initially that they were with us in favoring transparency and supporting workers. They flip-flopped. Now, in their earlier vote, they were against transparency for workers. And we're giving them a chance with this amendment to flop back, to recognize that when thousands of dollars per Canadian family are on the line, when public subsidies are going into companies that are using those public subsidies to hire foreign replacement workers instead of create good jobs here in Canada, that Canadians deserve to see what is in those contracts. So our amendments restore the original language that was used. I think it is the right and appropriate approach. It gives the NDP and all members a chance to actually stand with workers. There's an important principle here, Mr. Speaker, and that is that in a minority parliament, but in any parliament, frankly, committees should exercise the powers that they have to send for documents, to hold powerful people accountable, to challenge the executive, and to deliver meaningful results. What we have right now is a desperate, flailing government that is profoundly unpopular, that is responsible for untold misery across this country. And they are sustained in their position, not by persuasion, not by openness or argument. They are sustained by a secret backroom deal that leads to constant concessions from the NDP. We have, in effect, an NDP Liberal government where spending is out of control, where we see crime, chaos, and disorder escalating, and we have a prime minister, it's worth remembering, that 8 years ago said sunlight is the best disinfectant. He said that he wanted to lead a government that was open by default. And now we have not only a Liberal government that's against openness and transparency, but we have the NDP doing their dirty work, helping to hide these contracts, to hide this information. And their fig leaf of cover for it is to say, well, let's request an ATIP. Let's go through the ATIP process. An ATIP that the member doesn't need this committee to do. If the member for the NDP wants to do an ATIP request, he can go online just like any other citizen and file an ATIP request and ask if this information will be provided. I suspect he will find, if he hasn't used the ATIP process in a while, he will find that the government will stonewall him, will delay, will do everything it can to prevent needing to actually provide the information. And this is where, on critical issues of public interest, parliamentary committees should have the courage to exercise their powers. And we have an NDP Liberal government now that is shutting down that transparency. So I hope that the NDP will reconsider, that they will flop back to their original position after flip-flopping once, and they will support our amendment that will lead to the disclosure of these contracts, the full disclosure to the public of this contract. Again, we don't want MPs by themselves looking at these things in a dark room. We don't want, as Mr. Sousa and now Mr. Massey have proposed, restrictions and limitations constraining the ability of people to actually know what happened here. We believe in what the Prime Minister used to say about the value of sunlight and openness and transparency, and it's time that these contracts be disclosed. Mr. Chair, I'll leave my comments there. I believe Mr. Perkins is next. I look forward to hearing what he has to say.
Thank you for trying to take over, but I'm afraid it's Mr. Keurig, not Mr. Perkins. But go ahead, Mr. Keurig.
Well, no fear, Mr. Chair. I don't think that there's any reason to be afraid. I do, however, find and am becoming increasingly, as although not a regular member of this committee, I am a member of the Ethics Committee. And what I've found so incredibly disappointing is that you have at every turn, every committee, the Liberal government propped up by the NDP, a willingness to do everything imaginable to cover up, to shirk responsibility, to hide behind procedure, behind whatever it takes to keep answers from being made public. You know, Mr. Chair, this goes far beyond politics. We have seen over the last number of years a profound erosion of trust that has taken place in our national institutions. A profound erosion of trust that has led to many Canadians to question not just how their tax dollars are being spent, that's an age-old political question, but truly question every aspect of whether or not government can be trusted. And one of the most disappointing things, Mr. Chair, and I think I speak on many Canadians, for many Canadians on this, is that although the Liberals talked big about transparency prior to their election and continue to peacock that they care deeply about it, when it comes to action, they fail every step of the way. And Chair, to ensure that I keep this brief, I won't go through the many examples that I could point out where that has been the case, and in many cases where they will truly talk out of both sides of their mouth. And I've seen members of this committee that have been truly that have misrepresented what is trying to be accomplished here. But Chair, if I could, just to ensure that members of this committee as the book that governs us when it comes to the work that we do here is known as Bosch and Gagnon, and I'm reading specifically from House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, 2017. On page 137, it says, and I'll quote here for the benefit of all here in the committee, so that they would remember that they first serve their constituents by the power of what is the supremacy of Parliament in our system. That's important, Chair, because I think that we see that members specifically of the Liberal Party, but also those in the NDP, as my colleague Mr. Genuis had outlined, seem to be quick to serve their political masters as opposed to the purposes that we have to serve Canadians here. I will quote that on page 137, that the only limitations, which could only be self-imposed, would be that any inquiry should relate to a subject within the legislative competence of Parliament, particularly where witnesses and documents are required and the penal jurisdiction of Parliament is contemplated. This dovetails with the right of each House of Parliament to summon and compel the attendance of all persons within the limit of their jurisdictions. Chair, it goes on to say, interestingly, how the only individuals that committees are not able to compel the attendance to committee, and this extends to the production of documents, is the sovereign, the Governor General, Lieutenant Governors, members, senators, and offices of other legislatures or persons outside of Canada. Chair, we have the ability to get answers, and this committee needs to act on it, and the Liberals and the NDP need to serve Canadians, not their own personal political interests.
Let me interrupt you. We have bells ringing for a vote. I will ask the usual if we can seek consent to continue until closer to, and then we leave closer to the vote. "30-minute bells."
Yeah, like maybe 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes? Okay. Then we'll suspend. Oh, sorry, Mr. Baines is looking for 6. We'll go for 6.
So Chair, thank you for that, and I'm glad to have the confidence of this committee to finish my thought before handing it over to the very capable Mr. Perkins to continue. I would, however, when it comes to the substance of this amendment, it ensures that it has teeth, that it doesn't simply skirt over the substance of what Canadians deserve answers to in regards to a massive, absolutely massive government expenditure. We're talking thousands of dollars for every Canadian family. So, Chair, I will ask to be put back on the list. However, I would simply say that we saw before with the NDP flipping and voting against the common sense, very practical motion that we had brought forward. I suspect that pressure that the Liberals applied then, I would hope they reconsider and serve Canadians, not their political masters within the Liberal Party.
Before I go to Mr. Perkins, this amendment and Mr. Massey's motion both note somewhere along the line, I'll just ask someone to put through a change. It's asking for 3 weeks, landing at about Christmas Day. As much as I love to work Amy, I don't think she appreciated that. So, colleagues, just somewhere as changes come up, let's keep those dates in mind. Mr. Sir?
Just a clarification, we have the votes, so if we're
going to go for about 4 more minutes.
Yeah,
and we're gonna.
And then, okay, no, it's just fine, but then I'm just wondering how much time we get back here in time for, because we have interpreters and everybody else waiting here.
They're staying here.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Perkins.
Here we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'd like to say that between the discussions in the House and the Industry Committee and this committee, we're at a place here that's very disappointing because we've had a call, I think a fairly united call from the opposition parties to have the contracts released. There are clauses in the contracts that give the company the right to withdraw the things that are commercially sensitive, But other than that, the contract should be released. And in fact, the leader of the NDP has been up publicly calling for that in question period of the government. So it's surprising to me right now that what we have before us is an amendment that, or a motion that says, well, what we should do is have the contracts released and then have a secret discussion at some point about what the information commissioner says about the contracts. And I'll remind people that that is $44.7 billion worth of amendments that are $44.7 billion of subsidies that are in this between Northvolt, Volkswagen, Stellantis, and Ford. And the reality is that we're in this place because the government, the Liberals, don't seem to have their act together on what this does. It started off with an announcement saying there would be, in Volkswagen, the minister actually said publicly that there would be 30,000 jobs at Volkswagen. Turns out, of course, that's not true. That the contract itself, there are two contracts for each of these, a construction contract and a production subsidy contract, that wasn't true. That it's about 2,700 jobs. So, you know, plus or minus 10 times for the minister. And when it comes to the Stellantis contract, we know that even the president of Nexstar, the Stellantis company, seems to be confused. He's put out so many numbers that he qualifies to be a member of the Liberal government. He said only a week and a half ago there would be 2,300 local tradespeople to help with the construction and the installation of this plant. Now he says there's going to be 900 people coming from Korea to do that work. So which is it? It seems a different day, a different story from the company. And that's why we're calling for a little bit of truth here. And the truth comes from the release of the contracts. Most of the contracts are fairly simple. Understand these contracts are not some great corporate intellectual property secret. They are a contract about how much money per battery produced will the federal government subsidize these large global players for the production of them. And the IRA, the President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, sets out clearly what those subsidies are. They're 100% of the cost of the batteries will be subsidized by the taxpayers of Canada between now and 2029. And then in the following year, it'll be 75%. And then the following year, it'll be 50%. And the following year, it'll be 25% till we're down to no subsidy in 2033. That's public. That's what's in the IRA. And that's what is mirrored in these contracts, if you're to believe what the minister said, which is that these contracts mirror that. And having read the Volkswagen contract myself, the only one here that's read it, I can tell you that the minister is right. It does mirror the IRA numbers. And the PBO also said that in committee. So what you have here is until the year 2029, in all of these contracts, the taxpayer covering 100% of the cost of the production of these batteries. Wow, I'm shocked that any company would come here to Canada for 100% subsidy. And I don't think there's a fear that these jobs are going somewhere else, since nobody else other than the U.S. is offering 100% battery subsidy. Now, the NDP, and I'll put it more gently, you know, one of my heroes is Sir Winston Churchill, and he famously switched parties. He went from one party, the Conservatives, over to the left side, then he went back. And you know what he said? He said ratting, which it's called in crossing the floor. In England, it's called ratting. Ratting's easy. Re-ratting and going back to where you ratted from, that's hard. So we're giving the opportunity, as Mr. Genua said, for the NDP to give a consideration and re-rat. And go back to their original position, which was to call for the open, transparent release of these contracts so that Canadians can see exactly what it is their $44.7 billion of taxpayers' money, that's $4,213 per household, going to these large multinationals. So we're very disappointed that the NDP has chosen to change its position. We're hopeful through the debate that we'll have shortly that the NDP will listen to the logic that they once agreed to, which was transparency. We know the Liberals don't agree to that, but we're hoping that the NDP will come back to their original position, which is the best way to ensure that there are Canadian-only jobs, because the story changes every day, is for these contracts to be public. And I'll leave it for there, Mr. Chair, and go back on the speaker.
Just a point of order, Chair. I think we've exhausted the 5 minutes, so I'd like to move that we adjourn.
We have go to a vote to adjourn. The meeting. Moving to, there's a dilatory motion to adjourn the meeting. Yeah. We'll do this quickly, then we can.
Did Mr. Chin?
Colleagues. Okay, we're adjourned.